Erev Tov, everyone. Erev Tov. And welcome to the House of Seven Beggars. It is Monday night. Monday night. It is 8 p.m. here on the east side of the United States, here in the diaspora. This, of course, is the House of Seven Beggars. Therefore, it must be Zeyde's Story Corner. That's right, Zeyde's Story Corner. And we continue reading from the book Classic Hasidic Tales by Mayor Levine. And it's been some good stories. Yes, it has been very, very good stories. Especially the kind of spooky one from last week. It was really good. Yeah, that was one. Yeah. Okay, well, let's see what we got in the chat room. We have Shlomo and Shoshi, and we've got Miles. Miles has returned. Yeah, you're a couple of weeks late. Yeah, yeah, we've been on for a couple of weeks now, so good to have you back. Guy is with us, and Donald Willinger. So good to have everybody here, and those who are currently watching in the background, and those who will be joining us fashionably late. Yeah, yeah. Well, you would almost think it was time for shul services, wouldn't you? You would almost think so, wouldn't you? Yeah. Okay, so I guess we're going to pick up where we left off. It's a good story. Yes, yeah, it is a good story. So we should get you onto your camera here. There we are. No, I am good looking. Yes, yes. Well, you're always good looking. So okay, so we get on with the stories now, huh? Okay. If you remember, we were reading this story called The Sage and the Simpleton. And if you remember, there was these two men had the two boys, and one was very smart, and the other one, maybe he wasn't not so smart. And when they got older, they decided that the boys should learn a trade so that they could make their own money. So the simpleton, he becomes the apprentice to a shoemaker. And the other boy, he thought he was a little too smart to be doing that kind of work. So he goes and he runs off and he serves a couple of merchants until they take him to, I think it was Berlin, and then he leaves them and he goes and he finds somebody else and he learns that trade and he travels all around Europe, and then he gets bored with that and he learns another trade and he becomes a jeweler, very famous jeweler in Italy. And then he travels around, he goes to Germany and becomes a physician, and he's got a lot of crafts in his little bag of tricks. So that is where we were at this point. So I'm going to back up just a little bit to the previous paragraph. I see that Katai has joined us and Kelsey Lien. Good to have you. Okay, so the last paragraph before we start. In a short time, he became a skillful physician and a learned philosopher. Then all the world seemed stale to him, and everything in the world seemed but a trifle. He could do anything, and nothing seemed worth doing. But he could have anything, and nothing seemed worth having. So now we pick up the story where we left off. Of all the people whom he met, none were clever enough to talk to him, for beside his skill and his mastery of so many crafts, and his philosophy, and his knowledge of medicine, he found all other men simple. Then he became weary of going about the world, and he thought, I will marry and live quietly in my own house. When he had decided to take a wife, he sought in all the courts of brilliance, but could find no woman who pleased him, for all their talk seemed foolish, and he was tired of listening. Then one day, a new plan came to his mind. I will return to the town of my birth, he thought. They will see what a great man I have become, though I left the village as a poor boy. And there among them I will live in honor and in peace. Well, meanwhile, the simpleton had become a cobbler. And since he was a simpleton, he had to remain an apprentice for many years. And even then, he never quite learned how to make shoes. But he set himself up as a cobbler, and he took a wife. It was very difficult for him to earn his scant living, for he was not a quick or clever workman. He had to labor so long over each shoe that there was scarcely time for him to eat. But when he had pushed the needle into the leather and pulled through the thread, he would seize a bit of bread and eat. Nevertheless, he was a cheerful person, always merry, and though he was poor, he behaved as though he had every good thing in the world to eat, and the best wines to drink, and the costliest garments to wear. As he pulled through his thread, he would sing out, "My wife, let us have dinner. Bring in the lentil soup." She would give him a piece of dry bread, and he would eat it and say, "Ah, the soup tastes wonderful today. Now let's have the roast goose." His wife would give him another crust of bread, and he would eat it, and smack his lips and cry, "What a marvelous goose! What a wonderful cook you are, my beloved! Now, give me my mug of beer." She would give him a glass of water, and he would drain it down at a gulp, and wipe his lips with his hand, and his eyes would dance, and he would say, "Now let us have cakes and wine." So she would give him another bit of dry bread and another glass of water, and he would drink the water as though it were wine out of the king's cellar. The truth was that the simpleton really tasted fine lentil soup. The fish broiled in fat, the roast goose, and all manner of cakes and fruit, and in the dry bread that was given to him. And that water he drank was like beer and brandy and wine to his lips. And so it was with his clothes. He and his wife had bought one cloak for both of them, a ragged, bedraggled old sheepskin. When he had to go to market, he would sing out, "Sweet wife, give me my fur overcoat." Then she would give him the old sheepskin, and he would put it on his back, and turned one way and the other, saying, "What a marvelous fur coat! The rich will die of envy." And so he would go to the market. If he had to go among fine folk, as to a funeral, he would say, "Dear wife, bring me my frock coat." Then she would hand him the ragged cloak, and he would put it on, and cluck his tongue and say, "What an elegant frock coat!" And off he would go to the fashionable funeral. And when he had to wear a long coat to the synagogue, he would ask for his fine long coat, and she would bring him the sheepskin cloak, and he would put it on and marvel at its length and beauty. He was always lively and cheerful over his work, and whenever he had at last clumsily managed to finish a shoe, he would hold it up and gaze upon it and shower praise upon it. Even if the toe were where the heel should be, he would cry out, "What a wonderful work of art! What a beautiful shoe! A sweet shoe! A perfect shoe!" And marvel at the shoe. "See, wife, what a piece of craft it is! What a jewel of a little shoe it is!" Then she would say, "If your shoes are so wonderful, how is it the other cobblers receive 3 gulden for a pair of shoes, while you get only a gulden and a half?" "What have I to do with them?" he would retort. "That's their business. This is my business. Let us better find out how much profit I have made on this shoe." Then he would say, "Well, leather cost me so much, the thread so much, the nails so much, and so much." And he would add up all the figures and cry, "Why, I have earned 10 pence profit on this shoe." And he was happy and content, though everyone made a joke of him. The townspeople would come to his shop just to make fun of him. They would tell him all sorts of tales, for he was ready to believe anything. When they began to tell him something, he would say, "But no fooling?" And they would answer solemnly, "No fooling." Then he would listen and believe, even if they told him that a fence post had given forth milk. Can you imagine such a thing? And in the end, if he saw that he had indeed been made fun of, he would say, "Well, everyone knows I am a simpleton. What good does it do to prove yourself cleverer than I am? I'm so great a fool that you might be much wiser than I and still be fool enough." Then one day they came to him and said, "Do you know your clever friend is coming home?" And the simpleton cried, "Really? No fooling? And they said, "No fooling." He called to his wife, "Bring me my finest fur coat." And she brought him the old cloak, and he put it on and ran out on the road to meet the friend of his youth. The celebrated physician was indeed coming along the road in a great carriage, and when he saw the simpleton running toward him, the ragged cloak streaming in the wind, he thought, "The man surely is mad." But the simpleton greeted the sage with joy, crying, "Praise be to God for bringing you home and letting me live to see you once more, beloved brother." Then the philosopher, to whom all mankind was as dust, and all the world as offal, was indeed touched by the friendliness of the simpleton. And he took him up in his carriage and rode into the town with him. During the 10 years of his absence, the wise man's father died, and his house had fallen to pieces for lack of care, so that now the philosopher had no home. He went to the best hostelry in the village, but it was scarcely good enough for him, and he was troubled by the noise of many people, and the food did not please him, and he lived in constant torment. His simple friend came to him every day, asking if there were not some comfort he could bring him. And when the cobbler heard his friend complain so much of his quarters, he said, "Come to my house. I will give you the best room, and my wife will take care of your comfort, and you will be able to live as you choose." Well, the philosopher thought, "Perhaps it will be well," and he said he would go. Then the simpleton ran home and called his wife, and they cleaned the best room in the house and put all of their furniture into it, and spent their last copper so that the room might be as fine as they could manage. And the philosopher came to live there. Meanwhile, his fame had begun to spread throughout the kingdom. It was said that he was a marvelous goldsmith, and unequaled as a cutter of precious stones, and that his skill as a physician was miraculous, and people began to come to him to test his skill. A neighboring baron brought gold and asked him to make a gold ring. The sage set to work and wove a delicate ring of the precious metal, carving upon it beautiful orange tree, and every twig and leaf and each ripe fruit outlined. He looked upon his finished work and was proud, for he knew even in Italy this ring would be acknowledged as a masterpiece of the goldsmith's craft. But the baron came and took the ring and was angry because it was so thin and delicate and covered with many scratches. For the baron was a boorish fellow who could not understand the beauty of the work, and desired only that the ring be thick with gold. Then the philosopher was hurt at heart, that his labor should come to such an end. Again, a nobleman came to the philosopher with a precious oriental stone, upon which an image was engraved. And the nobleman brought a second stone and asked the philosopher to copy the image on it. Well, the sage set to work and copied the image so perfectly that no man could tell which was the first and which was the second stone. But the philosopher himself knew that once his hand had slipped less than a hair's breadth, and there was a jot of difference between one jewel and the other. And though the nobleman was greatly pleased with what he had done, the sage had only pain and heartache from his skill, because he knew that he erred. And from his skill as a physician too, he had only pain and heartache. For many sick people came to him, and among them was a man near death. The physician gave him medicine that he knew was proper for the disease, but the man was so far gone in his weakness that he died. And then the people all cried out that it was the physician's potion that had killed him. And when he came to another sick man and cured him, it was said that the man would have become well in the natural course of things. So, from all his skill and knowledge, the sage reaped only trouble and anguish. Thus, when he desired a new coat, he called the ablest tailor in the town, and took great pains to teach the man how to make a coat according to the latest fashion. And the tailor at last understood and made a fashionable jacket, except that he sewed one sleeve somewhat crookedly. And though there was no one in all the region who was enough of a judge of fashion to see that the sleeve was crooked, the philosopher was tortured with shame, for he knew that if he were to appear in the coat in the streets of Spain city, the people would at once detect the crooked sleeve and laugh behind his back. So the wise man was always troubled and unhappy. The simpleton would come to him laughingly and say, "Why is it that you are always so sad? Here I am a fool. I have nothing, yet I am cheerful and find joy in life. And you are so wise and so rich and so unhappy. If God would only let us change places so that I would be the sage and you the simpleton, then you might be happy too." The philosopher thought that the simpleton was surely mad, and he said, "A wise man might easily fall sick and lose his mind and become a simpleton, but it would be impossible for a fool to become a sage." Makes sense, huh? The simpleton answered, "Everything is possible to God. He can do anything. In the twinkling of an eye, he might make me wiser than you." And he laughed, and the philosopher laughed at the words of the mad, foolish friend. The fame of their friendship had spread far and wide, For through there are many fools and many wise men in the world, it is a strange thing for a fool and a wise man to be fast friends through childhood and into manhood. It became known everywhere that in a certain house, in a certain town, a fool and a philosopher lived together. And even their names were changed. The one who was named Fool, and the other Philosopher. And so their names were written in the books of the nations. Mr. Fool and Mr. Philosopher. One day the king looked through the books, and there came upon two names together, and he laughed. Then he was curious to see the two men called Fool and Philosopher. But he thought, if I send suddenly for them to appear at court, the philosopher may be so frightened that he won't know what to answer, and the fool may go mad with fear. I'll send the sage to the philosopher, and a simpleton to the fool. There are plenty of sages in a king's court, but where was he to find a fool to send as a messenger to the fool? It happened, however, that the king had appointed a simpleton to his treasurer, for he knew that if a clever man were made treasurer, he might steal the money that was in his charge, when a simpleton would be foolish enough to be honest. So the king gave the treasurer letters to take to Mr. Fool, and he gave letters to one of his sages to take to Mr. Philosopher. The two messengers took the letters and went on their way. They stopped to see the governor of the province, where the strange player lived, and from the governor they received more letters to the fool and philosopher, explaining that the king's message was not a command, but an invitation, and that they might go before the king or stay home as they wished, for the king did not wish to frighten them. What a nice king, huh? The messengers told the governor of the great wisdom and riches of the philosopher, and they spoke of the fool who ran about in his ragged cloak, believing it was a fur coat and a frock coat, and all kinds of coats in one. The governor said, if he is so poor, it will not look well for him to come to the king's court. And he took handsome garments and placed them in the carriage of the fool's messenger for the fool. When the king's foolish treasurer came to Mr. Fool with the king's letter, the fool said at once, but you know I can't read. Read it for me. I don't have to read it, the messenger replied. I can tell you what is in it. Then what does it say? It says the king wants you to come to visit him. And that is where we are going to pause. We are going to take a little break. And when we come back, we are going to find out what happened to Mr. Fool and Mr. Philosopher. So stay tuned. We'll be back in 6.
Let's all go to the lobby Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
It's intermission time, folks. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Step right over to our refreshment center for the most extravagant array of refreshment goodies ever assembled under one roof. Enjoy breathtaking, mouth-watering goodies. Everything from a snack to a delicious full meal. At our refreshment center, you'll find a large variety of goodies to satisfy your hunger, your thirst, or your sweet tooth. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Visit our refreshment center now. The show starts in 5 minutes. The show starts in 4 minutes. The show starts in 3 minutes. The show starts in 2 minutes. show starts in 1 minute. And now, on with the show.
And we are back, just as promised. Okay. So we should get on with this story. Well, don't you think? Yes, we probably should. Okay. You'll be glad when we get that new tablet going so that you won't keep photobombing me while I'm doing my show. Well, I can't help it. I got to turn the pages. Okay. Yes, we got a new book. We are going to be reading after this one, and we got it from Yivo. That is the organization that has made it its responsibility to save all of the Yiddish literature. And they have a huge library, and they publish some of the books in English. And they published a book of Yiddish stories. There are hundreds of them. I think the book is like 1,000 pages. So we've got plenty of stories coming up. So don't go away. Okay. Now we get back to this story, eh? Okay. So we talk about the fur coat and the frock coat and so that. Okay. So he asks him about the reading it, and he tells him what it is. Okay. So the fool looked at the fool and said, "No fooling?" And the fool answered, "No fooling." At once Mr. Fool bubbled over with joy and ran to his wife, calling, "My sweet wife, the king has sent for me." "For what?" she asked. But he had no time to answer her. He even forgot to ask for his gold-embroidered cloak, but rushed straight into the messenger's carriage, and they started for the court of the king. As he sat in the carriage, the simpleton saw the costly garments that the governor had placed there for him. So he put them on. And as he rode in the king's carriage, clothed in princely garments, his joy streamed up to the very heavens. In the meantime, the king had received news that the governor of the province was dishonest and a traitor. So the king decided to remove him from office at once. He had to choose another governor, and thought, "It must not choose a clever man, for this man was clever, and see what trouble he has brought upon me. It does not make such wisdom to make a good governor, only a good heart, and the will to be just. Any fool can be governor." And so he decided that since he had a fool for a treasurer, who fulfilled his duties as well as gave no trouble at all, he would send another fool for a governor. Makes sense. I mean, that's pretty much the way we do it here in the... Well, never mind. We won't go into that. Okay, so, and he sent out a decree that the simpleton who was on his way to the palace should be stopped when he came to the gates of the governor's city and be made governor there. So it was when the carriage with the two fools came up to the gates of the governor's city. There the people standing on the walls, and there were banners hanging in the streets, and the path of the carriage was strewn with blossoms. The elders of the city came out to meet the carriage, and they brought a great gold key so heavy that 6 men bowed beneath its weight. They presented the key of the city to the simple cobbler and said, "Hail to our new governor!" He looked at them and smiled and asked, "But no fooling?" "No fooling," they answered. So with great delight he went to the palace and became governor. It was said that good fortune makes wise men. Then it was revealed that he had enough wisdom to govern, for he ruled with simple honesty and trust in judgment of his heart between what was true and what was false. Soon he became famous throughout the kingdom as the wisest and best of governors. Each day the king heard tales of the marvelous judgment of the cobbler who ruled in the province. Then the king sent for him to come and visit the great palace. And when the fool came to the palace, the king received him with honor and sat down to converse with him. They talked on the ways of government, and the king was greatly pleased with the simple wisdom of the fool. "Tell me," the king asked, "how would you judge between 2 men who came before you if each of them declared he owned the same horse?" "One of them would be lying," said the fool. "And how would you find out which one was telling the truth?" "Well, when I was a cobbler," said the governor, "everyone knew what a great fool I was, and they would come and tell me all sorts of tales, because I believed whatever they told me. But they told me so many lies that it soon became easy for me to know when a man was lying and when he spoke the truth. All I had to do was to ask them, 'No fooling?' and they would tell me." The king was so delighted with the governor that he made him his prime minister and ordered that a palace be built for him next to the royal palace. It was second in grandeur and beauty only to the palace of the king, and there the cobbler lived. But when the king's wise messenger came to the philosopher with the king's message, the philosopher was not quite as the fool to obey. "Remain here overnight," the philosopher said to the messenger, "while we think about what it is written in the letter." That evening he made a feast for his guest, and as they sat over their dinner he thought, "Who am I that the king should send for me? I am only a little man in a little town, and he is a great king over a vast domain. what need has he of me? True, I am wise, but his court is filled with wise men, and he is himself a sage. It cannot be true that the king was sent for me." Then he said to the messenger, "Tell me, did you receive this letter from the hands of the king himself?" The messenger said, "No, the letter was given to me by a servant of the king." Then the philosopher smiled wisely and asked further, "Tell me, do you often see the king face to face?" The messenger answered, "You cannot be familiar with the customs of the palace, or you would know that the king is rarely seen face to face. And when he does appear before the public, he wears a ceremonial robe so elaborate that one can hardly see the king." "Then," said the philosopher, "have you ever seen the king at all?" The messenger reflected and answered. See, that's my reflection face. Okay, I have reflected now. Okay. The messenger reflected and answered, "No, now that you ask, I don't think I have ever really seen the king." The philosopher arose. "It is as I thought," he said. "There is no king." But the other wise man laughed and asked, "In that case, who rules the kingdom?" "I knew you would ask me that question," said the philosopher, "and I can answer you, for I have traveled all over the world and seen many things. There is no king in all the world. In Italy, for example, I saw the kingdom was ruled by 70 lords who came together and governed as they pleased, and sometimes a new baron would gather an army and overthrow the old lord. Then the upstart would be among the 70 governors. And so it is among us. There are powerful men who govern this kingdom, but they hide themselves behind the pretense that we are governed by a king." The messenger became very thoughtful and began to believe the words of the philosopher. "Tomorrow morning," said the philosopher, "I will prove to you that what I have said is true." And in the morning, the sage said to his guest, "If you will come to the marketplace with me, I shall show you how all the world is in error, obeying a king who does not exist." So they went out, and they came to a soldier who stood guard at the gate. "Whom do you serve?" asked the philosopher. "The king," the soldier said. "In all your life, have you ever seen the king?" asked the philosopher. "Why, no," the soldier said. Then the philosopher smiled and whispered to his companion, "See what a fool he is." They went further and met an officer, and they began to talk to him. And then the sage asked him, "Whom do you serve?" The officer answered, "I serve the king." "And have you ever seen him?" "Why, no," the officer said. Now the clever messenger was convinced that the philosopher was right. The whole world is in error, the messenger cried. There is no king. Come, let us go out over the world and show the people how they are mistaken. So they purchased horses and set out upon the roads. Wherever they went, they asked the people whom they served, and everyone answered, "The king." The two men laughed more and more each day, and told each other that all the world was in error, and that only they two knew the truth, that there really was no king. And so they traveled until their money was spent, and they sold one of the horses and their other horse. They sold their costly garments, and when they had sold everything they owned that was of worth, they became beggars. Still, they wandered up and down the roads, begging for scraps of bread and for copper coins, while they whispered to each other, "See how these fools are in error? They believe there is a king." And so it happened that in their wandering they came to that great city where the cobbler, who was now prime minister, living in his palace. And in the city there was a holy man, a true wonder worker, who had power of healing the sick, for he was the Baal Shem Tov, which means Master of the Holy Name. When the two wise men passed the house of the wonder worker, they saw many wagons standing in the courtyard, and they saw sick people being carried into the house. And the philosopher thought, "This must be the house of a physician." And since he had himself once been a celebrated physician, he thought, "I will go in and speak with him." So he asked the people near the house, "Who lives here?" "This is the house of the Baal Shem," they told him. Then he broke out into laughter. "Brother," he said to his companion, "these men are even greater fools than we have found in the rest of the world, for they believe that the Baal Shem has the power to heal them. But I, who am a physician, know better." Their long walk and day had made the two sages hungry, and as they still had a few pence that they had begged, they went to the public kitchen where food can be bought even for a few pence, and they sat down to eat while they talked of the folly of the people who believed in the Baal Shem. The keeper of the kitchen heard them talking and became enraged, for the Baal Shem was a very holy man in the city. So that the keeper said to them, "Eat what you have bought and be gone, for you cannot talk here against the Baal Shem." "You are a fool to believe this Baal Shem," said the philosopher, "for he is only an impostor who gets gold from people by mumbling words over their heads." At this, the cook became terribly angry and shouted to them to be still. But they would not be still. Just then more people came into the kitchen, and among them was the son of the Bolshem. And they heard what the philosopher was saying. The cook could contain his anger no more, and he seized a great iron ladle, and he rushed upon the two wise men. He swung the iron over their heads and shoulders, beating them until their blood ran, and they rushed from the kitchen, howling in pain. Then the philosopher cried, "We will seek justice against him for this beating." And they went to complain before the magistrate. "Why were you beaten?" he asked. "Because we told them the truth about the Bolshem." "And what is the truth?" asked the magistrate, who was a Gentile. "That the Bolshem is an impostor and a thief." And this the magistrate ordered them to be thrown in jail. But the philosopher said to his companion, "We will yet go before a higher court and receive justice." So they sat in the jail and waited. At last their complaints were heard, and they were brought before a higher court. And again they declared that they sought retribution against the cook who had beaten them because they spoke against a wonder worker. And again they were thrown into prison. So they complained to a still higher official, and they went from one court to another, until at last they came to the highest court in the land, where they would be heard by the prime minister. When the prime minister, who was in truth the cobbler, saw the philosopher brought before him, he recognized him at once as his friend of his youthful days, though he was no longer dressed in fashionable clothes, but in rags. The sage, however, did not recognize the simpleton who was now in majestic robes of a prime minister. "Do you not know me?" cried the prime minister. "I am the simpleton, the cobbler, your own faithful friend. See, the king has made me prime minister." "The king?" said the philosopher, and for the moment he forgot the cause that had brought him to court, and returned to his old folly. "Don't you know there is no king?" he demanded. "What are you saying?" cried the minister. "Have you ever seen the king?" "I see him every day with my own eyes," said the simple man. But the philosopher only laughed and said, "How do you know he is really the king? Do you know him from birth? Did you know his father? Did you know his grandfather? That you are so certain he is the king? Fool! People have told you, 'This is the king,' and you have believed them." Then the simpleton said, "Remember how we once talked together, and you told me that it would be easy for a sage like yourself to lose his wits and become as foolish as I was, but that I, the fool, could never attain wisdom like yours. Now see, I have become very wise, but you have not yet learned to be simple." Then he ordered splendid garments to be brought for his friend, and they sat down to dinner together. And the prime minister said, "Now, tell me, what was the complaint that brought you to the court?" "I came to seek justice," said the philosopher, "for I was beaten in a public kitchen." "And why were you beaten?" "The simpletons believe in a Bolshem, and I told them that the wonder worker was nothing but an impostor who took their gold." Just then someone came into the room and said to them, "The devil has sent for you." At these words the simpleton began to tremble with fright. He ran from the room and found his wife and said, "What shall I do? The devil has sent for me." "Don't be frightened," she told him. "We will ask the wonder worker to help us." The Bolshem came at once and spoke a prayer over the prime minister and purified him. Then the prime minister returned to the room where the philosopher had remained. "Why were you so frightened? Why did you run out of the room?" asked the sage. "Didn't you hear him say the devil had sent for me?" At that the philosopher broke into laughter. "My friend," he said, don't you know that there is no devil?" The simpleton asked, "Then who was it that sent for us?" "It must be my companion," said the wise man. "Perhaps he grew tired of waiting for me so long. He sent a messenger and told him to jest, to say that the devil had sent him." "If that is so, then would you go with him?" asked the simpleton. "Why not?" said the philosopher, laughing. And just then the messenger returned and said, "The devil has sent for you." This time the prime minister was not afraid, for he felt the power that the Bolshem protecting him. And the philosopher said, "He is surely come from my friend." Then turning to the messenger, he asked, "What does he look like, the one who sent you?" "He has red hair," said the messenger. "My friend has red hair," said the philosopher, laughing as he arose. "Then you are not afraid to go with him?" asked the simpleton. "Of course not," cried the sage. "But perhaps it would be well if you told 2 soldiers to go with me, because, after all, it may be some enemies of mine have sent this man, thinking to draw me into harm." So the prime minister commanded 2 soldiers to follow them, and the philosopher went with the strange messenger. And that is where we are going to stop for this evening. You'll have to come back next week to find out what actually happens. Okay, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Don't forget to come back on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. for the Torah study with Rabbi A and Reb Reuven. Until the next time, everybody, Laila Tov.